started building the modern DataFlex Studio, we chose, I think, the best possible programming language for the task, which is DataFlex, and we chose to build it using the best IDE we could find on the market, which is the DataFlex Studio, of course. So developing the studio in this way is a little bit of a bootstrapping operation because it's building itself one layer at a time or one iteration at a time. And we've learned lessons along the way about good practices to apply and not so good practices not to apply. I want to just diverge to a little side note for a minute. My ex-father-in-law was a really nice man, brilliant scientist. He worked at the University of Prague studying X-ray crystallography and applied that to studying protein folding. It's a very complicated field. But if I could say he had a flaw, it was that he had an opinion about everything. And he felt the need to give it freely, which could create some fiery discussions during family gatherings. One time he offered the unprovoked opinion that astronomy is not a science. Not astrology, that's a given. Astronomy wasn't a science. That was pretty annoying. But he followed that up with the pronunciation or the pronouncement that sociology also is not a science, which created an argument with one of his daughters, who happened to be an eminent young sociologist. Anyway, whenever I would turn up at family gatherings on one of my motorcycles, he was always amazed at how clean and new looking it was, even though it wasn't a new motorcycle. And he couldn't get over that. And he'd tell me about when he was a bit younger, he had a motorcycle. He never cleaned it. It was always rusty, covered in oil, and he just rode it, and he reckons it was reliable and always ran well. And in an apparent contradiction, he would fix it only when it needed fixing. And then he would say, well, actually, I think the reason why my motorcycle works so well is because I never cleaned it. And he was serious. He never wiped the oil off, apparently, and that kept it well lubricated. I think he was wrong about that. Firstly, I would try and tell him I think his idea of a reliable motorcycle was a little bit different to mine. And when you clean an engine, you can see where the oil leaks are. If it's covered in oil, you can't. And oil leaks lead to unreliability. And while you're going over the bike, you find all the loose bolts and you can fix them. You discover that the chain is dry and lube it before it gets rusty, and so on. When things are in order, you notice when something is out of place. And preventative maintenance is a good practice because one worn part will accelerate the wear on the surrounding parts, and those surrounding parts will accelerate the wear on the others, and so on. So if you follow my philosophy of motorcycle maintenance, it results in a bike that's safe, it's reliable, it'll give you good riding, and gets you home. Anyway, he wasn't very convinced. But it would have been more effective, maybe, perhaps if I'd asked him, simply forgot all that and just asked him, so, where is your motorcycle now? What happened to it? oh, it broke down eventually and wasn't worth fixing. Okay. So I think he was wrong about that. And when you take a look at people who are at the top of their game and how they operate, you see a different approach. In a garage like this one, you won't see any rust. You won't see any dust. What you see is attention to detail, preventative maintenance, and these things can be part of the strategy between winning or losing. So the DataFlex Studio is a pretty complicated machine also. There are around 650 DataFlex source files. There are parts of the studio that are actually written in C and built into the runtime for technical reasons. There are COM controls, COM components that we've written, many of them actually, some big ones that have to be integrated in there. There are plenty of externally written third-party COM components. There's even a fairly large piece of JavaScript there, which is written by Houten, which is what we use for the web application, the web app designer module. Everybody who has worked at Data Access in the product development team has contributed to the studio. So a lot of people work on it. It has to be fast, it has to be reliable, and it has to be extendable. And the modern studio it's over 10 years old already, but it doesn't show any signs of aging. It has been massively extended over those 10 years, and it still looks fresh, and it still has a great potential for further development. So what are the keys, what are the strategies to this kind of successful design? We employed careful, proven designs from the very beginning. We studied designs, especially at the beginning of the project. We did a lot of upfront design and prototyping. You want to have good APIs when you've got large, complex pieces interacting with each other. You want to build your code in a consistent way, package things together consistently, naming convention, consistent naming conventions, and so forth. And my idea is that you want to keep the code clean and tidy, and refactor all of those things. Feel free. You should consider refactoring all of those things when it's necessary. The studio is built up into functional modules, and there are plenty of them. There are the obvious visual modules, such as the code editor, the code explorer, table editor, the visual designers. I could go on. And there are non-visual functional modules also, such as the code generator, there's a code data structure, file manager, undo, redo manager, and so on. In summary, it's a large and complicated piece of software, and there are simply too many things to remember. If you're working on the software, you can only remember or have a good idea of one module at a time. While you're working on that module, you tend to forget the details of some of the other modules. There's just simply too much to keep in your head. So you need to employ strategies to help you, and actually use the studio itself to help you to keep track of the sort of details you would like to keep in your head, but can't. One of the code modules is a thing called the Action Manager, which which encompasses the studio's command set. And the command set are all of the things that the user of the studio can, the commands that they can perform, either clicking a button on the toolbar or selecting a menu option, or even actually clicking items in the dashboard, or even the web app designer, in fact. They're all channeled through this action manager via individual command objects. And, well, let's have a look at some of these commands. If I can. Oh. I have too many studios running. Here's a piece of code. I actually know how old this piece of code is because I tend to develop my programming style, evolve it as I go, and I can look at that straight away and I could tell you how long it's been since I touched that code. Ah, okay. I think I have to actually do it that way. Is that better? Okay. I can tell you how old that code is. It has never been touched since DataFlex version 12. You can see it's nice and tidy, though. It's sort of organized well. It's indented properly. The casing is all correct. I'm going to be a bit critical on look at this and critique it a little bit. I wrote the code, so I can do that. There are some comments in here that Sonny Folk would have said are time wasters. For example, this idea of creating a box of comments around the comment section. You know, you spend a lot of time just maintaining the position of these closing box comments, and Sonny swiftly sort of taught me that's just a waste of time. So every time you're editing some of these things, you have to then go and double the amount of work by keeping that tidy. And if it's all out of alignment, there's no point having it there either. So we use a pretty strong naming convention for all of the commands. We have them located in a subfolder. All of the commands in the command set are located in the commands source subfolder. If I open that up, you can see the full set of commands that can be called. And the naming convention's pretty clear. There's a prefix here. The prefixes are useful because they help to cut down on, I made the mistake of moving. They help to cut down on naming clashes. So all of our classes are prefixed with a lowercase c. All of the command classes are prefixed with CMD. It's pretty clear that, and every class is stored in a separate file. Every command class is stored in its own file. So there really is no need to have a comment here to say that this is the file that contains this class, because it's self-evident just by following the naming conventions. That's a time waster as well. I would get rid of that. Here's a really important comment. You can tell it's important because it says so. And in some cases, it's actually written like this, so it's really important. It's useless. Every line of code here is important. I started doing this a while back, once upon a time, because I made the mistake of not forward-sending construct object, and it took me a long time to debug that for some reason. And so I thought, I'm never going to do that again. But this is one comment that drives people crazy. I did it for long enough that it sort of started propagating around the studio, and it crops up everywhere. It drives some of my colleagues crazy. Here's another useless one. Why? It's obvious that this is the end procedure that belongs to the construct object. It's all there. I mean, actually, all I need to do is hover my mouse over the end procedure, and it's going to tell me that that's what it belongs to. So that's a useless comment. It's a bit worse when also there are two other things I don't like about that. One is, let's take a look at this example here. Let's say I want to refactor some code inside the isEnabled, and there's a bug we found, and it could affect every single isEnabled function call in all of the command set, and there's a lot of commands. So I might do a find in files for isEnabled and do the big search. Well, that's enough of that. There's lots of them. When I look at those, I'll see, in some cases, like I'm getting comments. Well, that's not one case. But I'm seeing not just the declaration, but, well, I've removed most of them now, actually. But you see comments coming up in the search result. And I'm actually looking for the function call itself. And these comments kind of pollute the return set of my find in files operation. So I find that quite annoying. There's another thing I would fault about the commenting the end function or the end class. It can be wrong. These things tend to as you're copying code around your system, these comments will propagate throughout your source code. And sometimes when I'm creating a new command, I'll copy a similar command and just copy all of that code. So I'm copying all of the comments as well. And you'll see that this comment is wrong because I copied the code from a different command, and the comment from that different command is still there, and it's wrong. So it's worse than a time waster. It's actually misleading as well. So it's better to rely on the studio itself to provide that information, which it can. And you can also see exactly where that block of code starts and ends by highlighting it, for example, in the Code Explorer. There's no ambiguity there, so I don't need that one either. And using naming conventions, you don't waste so much time. So good on Sunny, he was right about that. This is another command that's a little bit, it's been worked on more recently. These comments up here is just my notes for today. Here is an important comment, a truly important comment. The way that these things work is you can define a key code here, which would be the shortcut key that applies to that particular command. So there'd be a shortcut key for debug. In fact, there's a string that describes the shortcut key that's also used, but it's not defined. There's no definition for that hotkey. Why? That looks like a bug. But the comment will tell you that no, it's not a bug, because that hotkey is defined in a different command, which is the debug run command, and it will get redirected to this command from the first command if needed. So don't define it here because that will break that behavior. So that's a comment that's actually useful and prevents bugs. When we first started, this is my fault, so I should say I. When I first started building the command set, I had a much bigger prefix. Was instead of CCMD, it was C command. I liked to spell things out. So, but that was a bit self-defeating. You have to write use statements, for example, all throughout the code when you're using one of these commands. So you would write something like use, and then, well, I know all the commands are in the commands folder, so that's pretty easy. Let's see, I type 1, 2, 3, 4 characters, and I've already zeroed in on that folder, so that's good. And now I need to find the command. I can't remember exactly its name, but I know roughly how it starts. Well, I know it starts with, now, the old naming convention, I'd have to type out C-O-M-M-A-N-D, and I wouldn't get anywhere. They would all be prefixed with all of that. Then I could start to zero in on the file that I'm looking for. And that was tedious. That was wasting time. So having a shorter prefix actually saved time. So maybe I'm looking for the debug run. Or debug continue, that's good enough. Actually, I think it's called debug continue, not debug run. Oh no, that's the one I'm looking at now. Okay, so that's just a, so I refactored all of those files one day after I got so tired of wasting that time. I did refactor all of those, and I think the code is better. It's some time that had to be spent, but anyway, general practice for refactoring, apart from changing your name, changing a bad decision that you made in the beginning, is when code starts to get unwieldy, you look for patterns, and you refactor the code to apply those patterns. Here's another little tip is when you're actually calling one of these commands, you would write a line like send execute to, now the command manager is a global singleton object, and they're all stored inside, handles to those objects are all stored inside global variables. And then you have to pass a parameter to it, which is the command ID, which you can never remember, of course. What are the set of command IDs? I have to go and look it up. Which file are they even in? I can't remember which file they're in. So if you go down and look at the definition, for example, use the Studio to hunt the down the actually execute command, I think it is, to hunt down the thing you're trying to find. So execute command is stored in the Action Manager package. Here it is. And the parameter that I want to pass to it is of type CND ID, which is an alias type that I defined specifically for the set of commands. And if I do a go-to definition for that, you see that it leads me to the exact spot where all of these IDs are declared. And I could find it that way if I had to search through the whole list. At least I'd know where I could easily zero into the point where those commands are defined. So that's kind of a useful thing to do sometimes, is to declare an alias type above a set of constant declarations like this that apply to variables of that type. If you're using, if you're building global singleton objects and storing them in handles like that, it's a good idea to, in a global integer, a handle is essentially a global integer, it's a good idea to zero those integers out. Global integers have a funny special behavior in DataFlex that's a legacy. In certain cases, they can have an initial value passed to them. So it's a good idea to zero those out. Singleton objects are useful when you have something where you want to encapsulate a complex behavior, and you want that behavior to be available globally or applied globally throughout your application. Global functions can be useful too. If you have a behavior, a specific behavior this time, not a large, but just one particular operation that you want to be globally available, a global function can be useful for that. The behavior needs to be self-contained within that function, of course. Yeah, sorry, Mike?
I noticed that with your command findings, you were numbering them one by one all the way down.
Yeah.
Why did you not use an enumeration list for that?
There's a good reason. Where were they? Here. These guys. I sort of did. I applied the basic, the old basic. Where you had line numbers, programming strategy, where you would have line numbers and leave gaps. There are parts of the studio where these numbers are important and you don't want them to change. For example, the start center is actually a piece of HTML, and it's not DataFlex code at all, so it doesn't understand DataFlex constant declarations. And you're passing a number, in this case, to the studio. So when you're adding new commands in here, you don't want it to reshuffle all the numbers, because then you have to go and change HTML code for that. So it's for reasons like that. This was designed from the very beginning, actually, to be able to execute a command from some external source. Where was I? Functions. Well, let's have a little bit of a look. So in the studio, the global functions are stored in a subfolder. And what I would say is it's a good idea to declare every function in its own file, because sometimes I've seen code written where you are writing a class or an object module and you need a function, so you declare the function inside that file. Well, that function's not reusable anymore. It's a global function, but it can only easily be used in that single module because that's where you declared it. And to use it somewhere else, you have to use that file, and it would bring in all the other code with it, all the other code that you don't want. So global functions put each one in its own file, and since we have so many of them, we put them all in their own folder, and it makes it easier. What you don't also want to be doing is reinventing the wheel. You forget which functions you've got after 10 years. You need to do something like that. First, look to see if it already exists in the set of global functions before you go and write that function again. That's probably enough to say about that. There's another little challenge with visually modeling some pieces of code. I strongly believe that any user interface module you should use a visual modeler to design it. And ideally, if it's a DataFlex, of course, you would use the DataFlex Studio's visual modeler. If you want the UI to look good and be easy to maintain, it's the only way. But some modules are quite challenging to actually display in the visual designer. For example, if you have a view that has to be created dynamically, So you call a function to create it, and it's because it's maybe multi-instance. So you, then, well, an example might be the table editor. So where's the table editor? Let's go and find that one. It's a view inside the table manager folder. There it is, table editor. We'll open that guy. Here it is. It opens in the visual modeler, so that did work. Let's have a look at the code and see where this, well, yeah, I have to kind of give the answer away before I explain why, but you see there's an actual, this is a programming trick, which I'll describe in a minute. There's actually a label declared here. And let's see where that label is used. Find all occurrences. These two editor functions I use all the time. If you, that's why they're at the top, exactly. Yeah. So let's see where that's declared. That's found it already. By the way, when you're doing a search, you can, as soon as you've found the code that you found the file you want, you can cancel the search. You can cut it off and just. So here's the Studio's client area subclass. And there's a function inside that client area subclass that you call to create a new instance of the table editor, because you're opening a new table and you want it to be edited. And so one way you could design this would be to build that whole object structure right here. Not very convenient, because this is already a very big piece of code, and there are lots of these object structures that would have to be included. The table viewer is another one. The code editor is another one. No, the code editor is just one object, so that was okay. That one was not so bad. Designer was another simple one, so I didn't need to employ that technique. But yeah, so the code editor, the table editor, I should say. I lost where my cursor is. Oh, it must be here. Okay. Another way I could do it would be to declare a class, and in the construct object, have my whole object structure there. But actually, I like to, that means I have to build a class for every single object in the table editor that has got some declared functions and proceed. There's no way you could visually model it. There's no way you could visually model all of that very easily. So I didn't use that approach. I used this little trick here, which uses a evil go sub to this label and executes the object structure between the label and the end label. I can't even remember what the darn things are called. There's only a few places. Go sub return. But then you don't want this code compiling an object at the point where the use statement is for this package. So we use another trick here to, or actually compiling is fine. You don't want it executing that object structure where the use statement is. So we use another trick there, which is a simple if statement that surrounds the whole thing. I could have used a goto, though. That would have been more consistent, probably. I didn't want to do that. I just used an if statement around the whole thing. And the visual designer ignores all of that stuff. So it ignores the if statement, it ignores the label. And so it just thinks there's this object structure here, which is a studio view, and it'll visually model it. So that gives me something I can execute, but I can also put an object structure in here that declares functions inside of it. So you wouldn't normally be able to do that. So those are a few studio tips and design and coding philosophies. I promised not to go over time. If I was going to mention one other thing, I would be talking a bit more detail about performance testing your code. If you're performance testing, if you want to speed up, if you've got some performance problems with your code and you want it to run faster, and you need to optimize that code, optimizing can be very time-consuming. So you want to make sure that you spend your time in the most effective places. And the strategy for doing that is to test put code into your application to test how long the thing is taking to execute and which parts of your code are the ones that are the bottlenecks. And you work on the bottlenecks. You don't work on, you can find, I used to think this was inefficient. A for loop like this. Now, I used to think that was inefficient. If you imagine IMAX was 1,000,000, I've got 1,000,000 loops here, and for every loop, I'm calculating IMAX minus 1. Looks inefficient. If you measure it, it should be more efficient if I did it this way, perhaps. Decrement IMAX. And then I don't need the minus 1 here. So it's not executing a minus 1. Looks more efficient. If you measure the difference in that 1,000,000 loops, it's not measurable. Which means it's less than 40 milliseconds difference. I can't measure anything finer than 40 milliseconds. And when I did this test, because I used to write my code like this, now I don't bother, because that can give you this code could give you problems later if you're relying on IMAX actually being its real value, not its real value minus 1. So let me delete that code before I create a studio bug. Yeah. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.